The sun was a relentless overseer that morning, glaring down upon the endless stretch of prairie grass and jagged rock. Dust rose from the hooves of cattle being driven across the wide fields, while the dry wind carried with it the scent of sage and sweat. Out on the frontier there was no such thing as comfort, only survival. On the outskirts of Silverton, a small frontier town wedged between desert and mountain, lived Caleb McGraw, a tall, weather-worn rancher whose life had been reduced to long hours of toil and the impossible task of raising 6 children after his wife died 2 winters past. Caleb was not a man given to many words. His hat brim shadowed a face lined by sun and grief, and his eyes, blue as a mountain lake, carried the tired watchfulness of a man who had buried too much. Yet every dawn he rose before the rooster, tightened his belt, and worked the land, because there was no one else to do it. The children, ranging from the tender age of 5 to the lanky, restless stride of 17, did what they could, but it was never enough. A ranch was no small kingdom to manage, and hunger had begun to set into their bones. The cooking was poor, the house was crumbling at its edges, and Caleb had nearly resigned himself to the slow collapse of everything he held dear. That was when Evelyn Harper arrived. The widow Evelyn stepped off the stagecoach with a single trunk and the air of a woman who had nothing left but determination. She was 32, a widow herself, her husband taken by fever on the Kansas Trail 2 years earlier. She wore a plain calico dress, dusted from the journey, and a bonnet that shaded sharp brown eyes. Her figure was lean from hardship, her hands calloused not from gentleness but from necessity. Silverton was no place for delicate dreams, and Evelyn had long since learned that grief could either harden a soul or break it clean. She had answered an ad pinned to the notice board at the mercantile: widow or lady wanted. Cook and care for 6 young, fair wages. Room provided, inquire McGraw Ranch. Most women in town had scoffed. 6 children. On a ranch half a day's ride from Silverton, no salary could sweeten that deal. But Evelyn saw something else, a chance, perhaps, to belong again, to pour her hollow heart into a place that needed mending. So she walked down the main street, past the saloon where piano notes spilled out like broken laughter, past the sheriff's office where Sheriff Tom Baines watched with his eternal squint, past the dry goods store where whispers followed her. A lone widow, stepping into ranch life with 6 children and a hardened father. Folk already wagered how long she'd last. McGraw Ranch. Caleb McGraw wasn't much for visitors, but when Evelyn came riding up on the hired cart, he stepped onto the porch with a wary eye. The children clustered behind him like skittish calves, 6 pairs of eyes studying the newcomer. The eldest, Luke, 17, stood stiff as a man grown but carried his mother's gentleness beneath his stern front. Clara, 15, wore her mother's likeness most of all, and it was Clara who tried hardest to keep the younger ones clean and fed. James, 12, mischievous as a coyote pup, leaned against the rail, while Annie, 9, clutched a ragged doll to her chest. The last 2, Ben, 7, and little Maggie, 5, peeked from behind their father's legs. Mrs. Harper. Caleb's voice was low, gravelly. Yes, Mr. McGraw, I came about the position. The man studied her a long moment, as though weighing her soul right there on the dusty porch. He was not a cruel man, but trust was a rare coin on the frontier. Finally, he nodded once. You'll find the kitchen a poor excuse, and the pantry poorer still. But if you can cook beans and bread without burnin', you'll do. Evelyn straightened, refusing to let the weight of his bluntness press her down. I can cook more than beans and bread, Mr. McGraw. If you've got children to feed, you'll have food worth eating. That earned the smallest glimmer of surprise in his eyes. Then best get to it, he muttered, stepping aside. The first supper the McGraw kitchen was worse than she imagined. A blackened stove stood crooked, pans caked with grease, a table scarred by knives and childish hands. Flour was low, beans nearly gone, salt scarce. But Evelyn set her jaw and worked. By sundown the ranch house carried a new smell. Fresh cornbread, venison stew thickened with wild onions she had gathered, and coffee boiled just right. The children sat at the table wide-eyed, as though they'd stumbled into a dream. James whispered, "Smells like Ma's cooking," before Luke shushed him. Caleb took his seat at the head of the table, silent. But when he dipped his spoon into the stew, his shoulders eased just slightly. That night, for the first time in months, the McGraw children went to bed with full bellies and a warmth that wasn't just from food. The trouble in Silverton, but peace was a fragile thing in Silverton. Outlaws had been drifting through the territory, men with no regard for law or life. Sheriff Baines did what he could, but his badge was small against the tide of guns and greed. The worst of them was Elias Crow, leader of the Crow gang, a shadow-eyed outlaw with a smile like a snake. His men haunted the saloons, cheated at cards, picked fights, and took what they pleased. Folks whispered that Crow had his eye on land outside Silverton, and a ranch like McGraw's, with cattle, horses, and water rights, was the kind of prize men killed for. Caleb knew it. That was why his rifle never strayed far from reach. One evening, as Evelyn scrubbed dishes by lamplight, hoofbeats thundered down the trail. Caleb stepped outside, hand on his revolver, as 3 riders slowed before the ranch. Dusk cloaked them, but even in the twilight, Caleb recognized Crow's mark, a scar across his cheek that looked like it had been carved by a dull blade. "Evening, McGraw," Crow called, voice slick as oil. "Heard tell you've taken on help. Widow, wasn't it?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "My land, my business. You've no call to ride out here." A Crow grinned. "Just neighborly checking in. Pretty widow like that, Silverton might start talking. Be a shame if misfortune found its way to your doorstep." His meaning was clear as gunmetal. Evelyn, listening from the doorway, felt her stomach knot. Caleb didn't flinch. "Best keep riding, Crow. My doorstep ain't hospitable to snakes." A Crow's grin sharpened, but he tugged his reins. "We'll be seeing each other, McGraw, count on it." The riders turned, leaving only dust behind. Caleb lowered his rifle slow, but his eyes stayed on the horizon long after. Trouble was coming. The bonds forged in hardship days turned to weeks. Evelyn worked from dawn till night, cooking, mending clothes, teaching little Maggie her letters, scolding James when he tried to sneak off to fish instead of chores. She was strict, but her voice carried warmth, something the children had missed more than they knew. Slowly, walls began to crumble. Annie slipped her doll into Evelyn's lap one evening, as though offering a piece of her heart. Luke began to listen when she spoke, even if he argued first. Clara confessed in a whisper that she feared becoming motherless forever. Evelyn held her close, tears burning behind her own eyes. Even Caleb, though he kept to himself, could not deny the shift. He'd hear the children laughing again in the yard, their voices carrying like music through the dry air. For a man who had lived in silence too long, it was both balm and torment. Evelyn, in her quiet strength, was becoming more than just a cook. She was stitching a family back together. But the frontier had a way of testing every fragile thing it allowed to grow. At the ambush, it was on a trail back from Silverton that it happened. Evelyn had taken Clara and James with her to fetch flour and salt. The wagon rattled over ruts, wheels squeaking. The prairie stretched endless and golden under the lowering sun. Then came the thunder of hooves. 3 riders burst from a dry wash, faces hidden beneath bandanas. Guns glinted. "Stop that wagon," one barked. Evelyn froze, reins tight in her hands. Clara gasped, clutching James. The outlaw closest leaned forward, pistol raised. Evelyn's heart hammered, but something in her hardened. "This is a family's food," she said, voice steady despite her fear. "You'll have to shoot a widow and 2 children if you want it." For a tense moment, the man's eyes narrowed. Then, crack, a rifle shot split the air. The outlaw's hat flew from his head. Another shot followed, kicking dust at the hooves of his horse. Caleb McGraw came charging down the ridge, rifle smoking, jaw set like stone. With him rode Luke, clutching the reins tight but steady as a man grown. "Ride," Caleb thundered, firing again. The outlaws scattered, cursing, one clutching his arm where Caleb's bullet had grazed. Evelyn whipped the reins, wagon lurching forward. The family fled, dust billowing behind them until the sound of pursuit faded. When they reached the safety of the ranch, Evelyn's hands were trembling so badly she could hardly unhitch the horses. Caleb dismounted, eyes burning with a mix of fury and fear. "You should have waited for me," he snapped. "These roads ain't safe." Evelyn lifted her chin, though her voice shook. "And what would you have us do, starve?" The words hung between them, sharp as any blade. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Caleb's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him. He looked at her not with anger, but something rawer. Something he didn't have words for. Evelyn, breath uneven, realized her hands were still trembling. Caleb reached out, steadying them briefly before stepping back as if burned. The silence between them spoke louder than anything. The days after the ambush were restless. The ranch seemed quieter, as though even the land was holding its breath. Evelyn caught herself looking toward the horizon often, waiting for dust to rise. The children sensed it too. James stuck closer to home. Annie wouldn't sleep without her doll clutched tight, and Luke began riding the fence lines with his father, jaw set hard with the weight of responsibility. Caleb spoke little, but his eyes never softened. He kept oiling his rifle, kept checking the latch on the barn door, kept his revolver within arm's reach even at supper. It was as if he were waiting for something inevitable, a storm he knew could not be stopped. And he was right, because in Silverton Elias Crow was stirring up men like a rattler in dry grass. Word spread fast McGraw had stood up to him. Worse, a widow had defied him in front of his riders. Outlaws were men of pride as much as greed. That kind of insult demanded blood. The saloon confrontation. It was a Saturday when Caleb rode into town with Luke to sell cattle. Evelyn begged him not to go. Her gut screamed that Crow would make his move. But Caleb was stubborn as a mule. "I won't have him driven me from town like a whipped dog," he said, swinging into the saddle. The saloon was thick with smoke and cheap whiskey when they walked in. Men at the tables went quiet as Caleb's boots struck the floorboards. Crow sat at a corner table, cards in his hand, his scar catching the lantern light. Well now, Crow drawled, tossing his cards down. McGraw himself, and the boy. Brave pair riding in here. Caleb didn't sit. His voice carried steady, though tension coiled in every line of his body. I came to do business. I'll not have trouble? A Crow leaned back, boots on the table. Trouble's already yours, McGraw. You just ain't buried under it yet. Luke's hand twitched near his sidearm, but Caleb's glance froze him in place. The saloon was a powder keg. One wrong twitch would set it off. Sheriff Baines finally pushed through the crowd, his badge gleaming dull. Crow, McGraw, you'll not turn my town into a graveyard. Not tonight, Crow smirked, rising. He brushed past Caleb, close enough their shoulders nearly touched. His whisper was for Caleb alone. Enjoy your ranch while you can. Next time I'll come callin'. And then he was gone, his men following like shadows. Preparing for war that night, Caleb returned grim-faced. He told Evelyn everything. She listened silent, before finally setting down the pot she was washing. Then we prepare, she said simply. Caleb blinked, almost startled. Prepare? You think I've lived through fever, hunger, and burying a husband without learning to fight for what's mine? Those children are mine now, too, and I'll not hand them over to Crow. For the first time, Caleb saw the steel in her. Not just the cook, not just the widow, but a woman forged by loss into iron. He nodded slowly. The McGraw ranch became a fortress. Luke and Caleb dug trenches along the fence line. James carried water from the well till his arms ached. Clara stitched torn blankets into makeshift curtains to hide lamplight at night. Evelyn boiled coffee strong enough to keep men awake till dawn. The children weren't spared. Annie and Ben practiced loading cartridges under Evelyn's watch, their small fingers fumbling but determined. Maggie, too small for chores, sat wide-eyed, clutching her doll, watching it all with a child's solemn silence. Every sunset, Caleb looked at his land, the cattle, the barn, the weathered house, and wondered if he was staring at it for the last time. The night raid, it came 3 nights later. The howl of coyotes was cut short by the thunder of hooves. Dogs barked wildly as shadows poured across the fields. Shots cracked, horses screamed, and flames leapt up as a torch struck the hay shed. Crow, Caleb roared, firing from the porch. The children scrambled inside as bullets shattered wood. Evelyn shoved them down behind the table, her body shielding them. Stay low! Don't move, she ordered, voice firm though her heart pounded. Luke was already at his father's side, rifle steady. I can fight, Pi. Caleb hesitated, but there was no time for softness. Then fight, son. The night erupted into chaos. Muzzles flashed like lightning, horses thundered, men shouted. Caleb dropped 2 riders before they cleared the gate. Luke's shot clipped another's shoulder, but Crow's men kept coming, ruthless, relentless. Evelyn darted between cover, hauling buckets of water to douse the flames. A bullet tore through her skirt, grazing her thigh, but she bit back the pain and kept moving. Inside, Clara held the little ones, whispering prayers. Crow himself rode at the front, black duster flapping, revolvers spitting fire. Burn it all, he bellowed. Leave nothing? The turning point. For hours it seemed the ranch would fall, but dawn was a stubborn ally. As the sky began to pale, Crow's men grew desperate, reckless. That's when Sheriff Baines rode in with a handful of townsfolk, rifles blazing. The tide turned. Outlaws scattered, dropping bodies in the dirt. Crow, furious, fought his way toward the porch. His bullet grazed Caleb's shoulder, spinning him back. Evelyn screamed, rushing to drag him inside. And then it happened. Crow dismounted, striding toward the porch, gun aimed. The children froze, wide-eyed, as death walked toward them. But Evelyn stepped out. Her hands shook, but she held Caleb's revolver square at Crow's chest. Not one more step, she said, voice steady as iron. Crow sneered. You think you can kill me, woman? I don't have to think, she whispered, and she fired. The shot slammed Crow backward, dust rising as he fell. Silence followed, broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors. Crow lay in the dirt, eyes wide, chest still. His men fled into the hills. The war was over. An aftermath smoke hung over the ranch, but it still stood. Caleb's shoulder was bound. Luke carried himself like a man twice his age, and the children clung to Evelyn as if she were the only solid thing left in the world. Sheriff Baines tipped his hat, grim but respectful. Reckon you folks don't need me telling you what you already proved. McGraw Ranch don't bow to outlaws. When he rode off, the family was left standing in the ruined yard, exhausted, bruised, but alive. Evelyn finally let her knees give way, tears spilling, relief, grief, all of it. Caleb knelt beside her, his rough hand cupping hers. For a man who spoke little, words were hard, but he forced them anyway. You saved us, Evelyn. Saved my children. Saved me. She shook her head. No, we saved each other. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Something as fragile and fierce as the dawn itself. A new beginning. Weeks passed. The ranch healed. Fences were mended, fields replanted, laughter returned to the yard. Evelyn's wound healed clean, leaving only a scar as reminder. Caleb's shoulders stiffened in the mornings, but Luke took more weight on his young back with pride. One evening as the children played in the yard, Caleb stood with Evelyn on the porch. The sky was painted gold, the horizon endless. "They call you Ma now," Caleb said quietly. Evelyn smiled, tears brimming. "I know." He cleared his throat, fumbling. "I can't give you back what life took, but I can give you a home, a family, if you'll have it." Her heart ached, full in a way she hadn't thought possible again. She slipped her hand into his, strong and certain. "I already do." The children's laughter carried across the prairie, wild and free. For the first time since sorrow had hollowed them, the McGraw ranch felt whole, and so the widow who was hired to cook became something greater: mother, protector, heart of a family bound by fire and blood. The frontier would always be hard, but they would face it together.